Help me, please." The trembling voice echoed through the room as the call connected. John Harris, a 93-year-old veteran, gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles pale against the worn receiver. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice calm but firm, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. The muffled sound of roaring engines filled the air as a group of men in dark suits loitered on his front lawn. Beyond them, sleek black cars with government plates blocked the narrow street, their presence both intimidating and deliberate. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned against a car, puffing on a cigar. His cold eyes scanned the house, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've had your chance, old man," he muttered under his breath. "Time's up." Inside, John moved with a steadiness that belied his years, the faint gleam of military medals on the shelf behind him catching the dim light. With his free hand, he pulled a crumpled envelope from a drawer, an eviction notice stamped with bold red letters. "Final warning." John's voice dropped to a low growl. "You think you've won," he said, speaking as much to himself as to the man on the line. "But I've been through worse than this. Far worse." "Sir," the voice on the other end replied urgently, "do you want me to notify the authorities?" John's lips tightened into a grim smile. "Number this time. I'm making a different call." He hung up abruptly and reached for another phone, an old rotary model yellowed with age. His fingers dialed a number he hadn't used in decades. As the line buzzed, his weathered face betrayed no fear, only the resolute calm of a soldier preparing for battle. "John Harris," the voice on the other end finally answered, deep and commanding. "I wondered when I'd hear from you again." John's eyes flicked toward the window, where the men outside had started moving closer to his door. His voice was steel. "It's time. Activate Protocol 93. The man on the line hesitated, then said, "Understood." John hung up and turned to the door as the first loud knock reverberated through the house. A storm was coming, but John Harris, a veteran of wars, both seen and unseen, was ready. What is Protocol 93? And who did John call? Why are the officials so desperate to take him down? This suspenseful opening hooks the audience, establishing John as a formidable yet mysterious figure while leaving them hungry for answers. The knock came again, sharper this time, like a hammer striking steel. "Open up, Mr. Harris," a voice barked from the other side. "This is your final warning. Failure to comply will result in forcible entry." John stood still for a moment, his hands resting on the armrest of his chair, eyes locked on the door. Memories of his wartime days flashed through his mind, days when standing firm against impossible odds wasn't just survival, but duty. He slowly rose, his back straight despite the years that had worn on him, and made his way to the door. Peeking through the small, dust-covered window beside it, he saw the leader of the group, Armand Brewer, the city official notorious for forcing people off their land. Brewer adjusted his tie, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. "Mr. Harris, this is your last chance. We're authorized to evict you," Brewer said, his voice dripping with false authority. "Why make this harder on yourself? Just sign the papers and leave peacefully." John unlocked the door but didn't open it fully. Instead, he stood in the narrow gap, his frame imposing despite his age. "Peaceful? Is that what you call this circus?" His tone was steady, cutting through Brewer's bravado like a knife. Brewer laughed, though it sounded forced. "This isn't personal, Mr. Harris, just business. The city has plans for this property, and your time here is over." John's eyes narrowed. "You mean your plans? You've made a career out of stealing what doesn't belong to you, but you made a mistake this time." Brewer raised an eyebrow. "And what mistake is that?" John's faint smirk returned. "You underestimated the wrong man." Before Brewer could respond, a distant rumble filled the air, a sound too deliberate to be mere coincidence. Brewer's smug expression faltered as his men exchanged uneasy glances. The source of the sound grew louder, closer. A convoy of military vehicles, sleek black SUVs with tinted windows, rolled into view. Their precision was unmistakable, their presence commanding. The officials on the lawn began backing away, unsure of what they were witnessing. One SUV came to a stop directly in front of John's house. The door opened and a tall man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out. His presence alone was enough to silence the murmurs among Brewer's crew. The man adjusted his sunglasses and walked up the driveway with a purposeful stride. "Mr. Harris," he said, extending a hand. "It's been a long time." John shook his hand firmly. "Not long enough, Conrad." Conrad smiled faintly, then turned to Brewer, his expression hardening. "Gentlemen, I suggest you vacate the premises immediately. This property is now under federal protection." Brewer's face flushed. Federal protection? On whose authority? Conrad pulled a sleek badge from his pocket, its seal glinting in the sunlight. "On mine. Special Agent Conrad Dale, Homeland Security." Brewer stammered, his confidence evaporating. This is outrageous. We're here under city authority." Conrad stepped closer, towering over Brewer. "And I'm here under federal authority. Do you want to test which one of us outranks the other?" Brewer's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he gestured to his men. "Let's go." The group retreated hastily, their vehicles kicking up dust as they sped away. Conrad turned back to John, his demeanor softening. "You always know how to make a scene, don't you?" John chuckled. "Old habits die hard." As the two men walked inside, the tension began to ease. But deep down, John knew this wasn't the end. Brewer and his cronies wouldn't back off so easily, and the stakes had just been raised. Cliffhanger. Who is Conrad, and why does John's property require federal intervention? What are the deeper connections tying Brewer's plans to John's past? The next chapter will unravel these layers, maintaining the suspense while delving into John's hidden power and the growing threat looming over him. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, muffling the sound of retreating engines. Inside the house, the air was thick with an unspoken tension as Conrad removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that hadn't dulled with age. "You cut it close, Conrad," John said as he eased into his chair, the weight of his years momentarily visible. "I almost had to handle it myself." Conrad smirked. "I'd never let that happen, John. You know that. But it's been a while since I've gotten a call with Protocol 93. I didn't even think you'd kept the number." John leaned back, his gaze drifting to the medals on the shelf. "When you've lived my life, you don't throw away old allies. Not when you know the kind of enemies you might face." Conrad's expression turned serious. "Speaking of enemies, those city officials weren't just here for property taxes. We've been tracking Brewer's dealings for months. He's connected to something bigger, people who don't take kindly to resistance." John's eyes narrowed. "What kind of people?" Conrad hesitated, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file. "A syndicate," he said, placing the file on the table. "They've been using crooked officials to launder money through property acquisitions. Brewer's just a puppet. The real players are higher up." John flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the documents. There were photos of shadowy figures, lists of offshore accounts, and a map with red dots marking locations across the state. Properties already seized. Conrad pointed to one of the photos, a grainy image of a man in a tailored suit. "This is Victor Lang, the head of the operation. He's ruthless, untouchable, and determined. If he's got his eyes on your property, it's because it holds strategic value." John's lips tightened. "Strategic? For what?" "We don't know yet," Conrad admitted. "But it's critical enough that Lang's willing to put the squeeze on a decorated veteran to get it. That tells me it's not just about money." John's jaw clenched as he closed the file. "This land doesn't just belong to me. It's a legacy. My wife's, my family's, and this town's. I'm not going to let some syndicate steal it because they think I'm an easy target." Conrad nodded. I figured you'd say that, which is why we're going to fight back. Fight back? John raised an eyebrow. I'm not exactly a young soldier anymore, Conrad. What are you proposing? Conrad's smirk returned. You may not be in the field anymore, but I remember who you are. The strategist. The man who led impossible missions and always came out on top. I don't need you to fight, John. I need you to lead. John sat silently for a moment, his mind working through the weight of Conrad's words. He glanced at the file again, then back at Conrad. What's the plan? Conrad pulled out a laptop and opened it, revealing a detailed map of the surrounding area. Lang's syndicate relies on intimidation and secrecy, but they're not as invisible as they think. We've been gathering intel, and with your help, we can expose their operation. Once we shine a light on them, even their money won't save them. John leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. You've got my attention, but if we're going to do this, we're doing it my way. Conrad grinned. I wouldn't expect anything less. What is John's plan to dismantle Lang's syndicate? Why does this land hold such importance to Lang's operation? The next chapter will delve deeper into John's strategic mind and the first steps of their counterattack. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, casting golden light across John's weathered house and the fields surrounding it. John stood on the porch, his hands gripping the railing as he took in the familiar sight. But today wasn't like other mornings. Today was the beginning of a battle. Behind him, Conrad was setting up a makeshift operations center in John's living room. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting a laptop, secure communication devices, and a flat screen displaying surveillance footage from hidden cameras planted around the property. Lang's men will want to make a move quickly, Conrad said, not looking up from the screen. Once they realize Brewer failed, they'll escalate. The question is how. John turned, his expression grim. Then we make them show their hand first. Conrad looked up, intrigued. What do you have in mind? John stepped inside, motioning to the table where an old, hand-drawn map of the property lay. This land isn't just valuable because it's mine. It's valuable because of what's under it. He pointed to a shaded section of the map. These woods hide an old military supply bunker, left over from World War II. Not many people know about it, but if Lang's people are as connected as you say, they've likely found out. Conrad's eyes widened. A bunker? Are we talking weapons? John shook his head. Number. It's long since been cleared out, but the infrastructure is intact. If they're interested in it, it's because of the location. They could use it for smuggling, storage, or worse. Either way, we make it our bait. Conrad grinned, impressed. And how do you plan to lure them in? John walked to a nearby cabinet and retrieved a stack of envelopes, each filled with faded documents stamped classified. He tossed them on the table. We let them think there's something they want, something I'm trying to protect. Conrad picked up one of the envelopes, thumbing through the old papers. These look legitimate. They are, John said. Or were. They're outdated now, but Lang doesn't need to know that. Conrad leaned back in his chair, nodding. We plant the bait, let them take it, and follow the trail to Lang. And when they come for it, John added, we'll be ready. John and Conrad worked into the evening, planting the forged documents in strategic locations around the property and setting up motion-triggered cameras to capture any movement. The air crackled with tension as they finalized their plans. Once Lang's men take the bait, we'll need to track them in real time, Conrad said, double-checking the live feeds. I've got agents on standby to intercept, but we'll need confirmation they're carrying the documents. John nodded, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitors. They'll come. Men like Lang always do when they think there's something to gain. As midnight approached, the two men sat in silence, the stillness broken only by the hum of the equipment. John's mind wandered briefly to his past, to nights spent in enemy territory, waiting for the moment when the fight would begin. His body might have aged, but his instincts were as sharp as ever. Suddenly, one of the cameras picked up movement, a pair of headlights cutting through the darkness at the edge of the property. "They're here," Conrad said, his voice tense. The car stopped just short of the house and two figures emerged, their movements cautious. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. One carried a flashlight, the other a crowbar. "They're going for the workshop," Conrad whispered, pointing to the monitor showing the back of the property. John's eyes narrowed. "Good. That's where the first set of documents is. Let them take it." The men retrieve the documents and leave, unaware they're being tracked. But as they drive away, John notices something unexpected. A third figure watching from the tree line, almost as if monitoring the operation. Who is this unknown observer, and are they working for Lang, or someone else entirely? The black SUV disappeared into the darkness, the hum of its engine fading as John and Conrad monitored the live feed. The two masked men had taken the bait, a forged set of documents carefully planted in the old workshop, and were heading back to their employer. But John's focus wasn't on the SUV. His eyes were glued to the figure in the tree line, partially hidden by the shadows. The unknown observer stood still, watching the property even as the SUV sped away. "Conrad," John said, his tone sharp, "pull up the feed from camera 4. Conrad tapped a few keys, switching the display to a closer angle. The figure's outline became clearer, a tall man wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried no visible weapons, but his presence radiated unease. "Who is that?" Conrad asked. "Not one of Lang's men," John muttered. "Too deliberate. Lang's people don't just watch, they act." The figure lingered for a moment longer, then turned and melted into the woods, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. "What now?" Conrad asked. John's face hardened. "We stay on the SUV. Whoever that was, they'll surface again. For now, let's follow the trail." Conrad's secure laptop displayed a live GPS map, the SUV's location pinging in real time. A tracking device hidden in the envelope of forged documents was doing its job. "They're heading toward the industrial district," Conrad noted. "Could be a drop site." John leaned over the map, studying the route. "Too open. Lang's smarter than that. They'll use a relay system, pass the package to another team to cover their tracks." Conrad smirked. "Good thing we're smarter." As the SUV entered the district, it turned down a narrow, dimly lit road lined with warehouses. The GPS signal flickered briefly, then stabilized. "There," Conrad said, zooming in. The SUV had stopped behind a warehouse marked with faded signs. John grabbed his coat. "We're moving. I need to see this in person." The air was damp and heavy with the smell of oil and rust as John and Conrad parked a safe distance away and approached on foot. They kept to the shadows, their steps silent on the gravel. Peering around a corner, they spotted the SUV, its headlights off, parked beside a loading dock. The two men from earlier were talking to a third, a burly figure wearing a leather jacket, a pistol holstered at his side. "Relay team," John whispered. Conrad nodded. "They're handing off the documents. We need to see who they pass them to." The exchange was quick. The burly man took the envelope, inspected its contents briefly, then handed it off to a fourth figure, slim and agile, with a face obscured by a hood. The hooded figure climbed onto a waiting motorcycle and sped off into the night. "We have a courier," Conrad said, already pulling up his phone to input tracking details. John's hand stopped him. "Wait." Conrad frowned. "What are we waiting for?" John's eyes were fixed on the burly man who was gesturing toward a second envelope in his hand, a decoy planted in the bunker. He handed it to the original team and gave them instructions before they climbed back into the SUV and drove off. "Lang's splitting the bait," John said, a note of admiration in his voice. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for." "We can't follow both," Conrad said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We won't have to," John replied, his mind already working. "Lang will focus on whichever envelope contains the information he's after. If the courier and the SUV split up, we stick with the courier. Lang doesn't trust his own people for the final delivery. He'll only use someone he can control. As John and Conrad prepare to tail the courier, the camera feed from John's house suddenly cuts out. The unknown observer has returned, this time disabling the cameras one by one. Is this a distraction, or is something more sinister at play? The grainy monitor went black, and Conrad swore under his breath. That's no accident. Whoever this guy is, he knows exactly what he's doing. John leaned over the laptop, scrolling through the feeds. Camera after camera went dark, their signals lost in rapid succession. The figure in the tree line had returned, moving with surgical precision to dismantle the surveillance network. They're not just watching anymore, John muttered. This is deliberate. We can't let this pull us off track, Conrad said. We have the courier to follow, and that's the priority. John hesitated, his instincts pulling him in two directions. But years of military discipline took over. You're right. We'll handle the courier first. The house can hold its own for now. The motorcycle roared down the empty streets, weaving through traffic with a practiced ease. John and Conrad followed at a careful distance in Conrad's unmarked SUV, the tracking beacon ensuring they didn't lose their target. The chase took them out of the industrial district and into the countryside, where the roads grew darker and less traveled. Finally, the courier slowed, turning onto a dirt path leading to an abandoned farmhouse. Looks like a dead drop, Conrad said, cutting the engine a safe distance away. John nodded. Stay here. I'll get closer. John, you're not exactly... John shot him a look that silenced the objection. I've been doing this longer than you've been shaving, Conrad. Stay on the comms. Conrad sighed but relented, watching as John disappeared into the shadows. The courier parked the bike behind the farmhouse and dismounted, the envelope clutched tightly in their hand. They moved cautiously, scanning their surroundings before slipping through the broken doorway. John crept closer, his steps silent on the soft earth. Years of experience in reconnaissance had honed his every movement. He reached a broken window and peered inside. The room was dimly lit, the courier standing in the center. Another figure emerged from the shadows, tall, imposing, and instantly recognizable from the file Conrad had shown him. Victor Lang, John whispered. Lang took the envelope, flipping through its contents with a frown. His cold, calculating demeanor radiated power. This isn't what I wanted, he said, his voice low but sharp. The courier shifted nervously. It's what we were given. Harris is holding something back, I'm sure of it. Lang's expression darkened. Harris is smarter than I gave him credit for. That's unfortunate. For him. John's grip tightened on the windowsill as Lang continued. If Harris wants to play games, we'll raise the stakes, burn the house, make it clear that his defiance has consequences. John withdrew as silently as he'd approached, slipping back to Conrad's SUV. They're moving on the house, he said, urgency lacing his voice. Conrad started the engine, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped back toward the property. We should call in backup. No time, John snapped. If Lang's men torch the house, we lose everything. The real documents, the safe room, everything we've worked for. As they raced down the road, Conrad pulled up the remaining live feeds. A chill ran through them both. The cameras were completely offline. I hate to say it, Conrad said grimly, but whoever's sabotaging the surveillance might already be there. When John and Conrad arrive at the house, flames are licking the edges of the porch, and Lang's men are nowhere to be seen. But amidst the chaos, a single figure stands in the driveway, the unknown observer, waiting, as if daring John to step forward. The next chapter will bring John face to face with the mysterious figure, forcing him to confront an ally-turned-adversary while Lang's plot escalates into a dangerous endgame. The SUV screeched to a halt just shy of the burning porch. John stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The figure in the driveway didn't move, standing tall and still as the firelight painted shadows across their face. Conrad stayed behind the wheel, hand on his radio. "John, we need to secure the house before it's too late." "Not yet," John said without turning. His focus was locked on the figure, his mind racing. Something about their stance, their composure. It felt familiar. The figure finally stepped forward, the fire reflecting off a clean-shaven face. His features were sharp, his dark eyes piercing as they met John's. "It's been a long time, Colonel," the man said, his voice cold but steady. John's breath hitched. The voice was unmistakable. "Mason Carter," he said quietly, his words laced with disbelief. "I thought you were dead." Mason smirked, his eyes hard. "You of all people should know better than to trust what you hear." Conrad stepped out of the SUV, watching the exchange warily. "Who is this guy, John?" "Someone I served with," John said, his voice tight. "A soldier who went missing on an op decades ago. We thought he didn't make it out." Mason laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You didn't think I made it out, or you didn't want me to?" John's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here, Mason?" "I could ask you the same," Mason replied, circling him like a predator sizing up prey. "You always were the hero, weren't you? The golden boy, while the rest of us were left to rot." "This isn't the time," John said, his voice firm. "Lang's people are coming for the house. If you've got a vendetta, we can settle it later. Right now, we need to stop them." Mason's smirk faded. "Stop them? I'm the one who told them where to find you." The words landed like a blow. John stared at Mason, trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the soldier he'd once trusted. "Why?" John asked, his voice heavy with betrayal. "Because Lang's offer was better than your silence," Mason said flatly. "You didn't think I was just going to disappear, did you? You left me behind, Harris. Now I'm making sure you pay for it." The sound of engines in the distance cut through the tense silence. Lang's convoy was on its way. Conrad raised his weapon, his stance shifting into a defensive position. "We don't have time for this, John." Mason's hand moved to his belt, drawing a sleek pistol. "You're right. It's time to end this." Before Mason could aim, John lunged, knocking the gun from his hand. The weapon clattered to the ground as the two men grappled, their movements swift and precise despite their age. "Mason, stop!" John barked, pinning his former ally against the SUV. "You think Lang's going to honor whatever deal he made with you? You're a loose end to him, just like you are to me." Mason's expression flickered with doubt for a moment, but his resolve returned. "Doesn't matter. I've got nothing to lose." John shoved him back, his chest heaving. "Then help me. Prove you're more than just a pawn in Lang's game." Mason hesitated, the firelight casting long shadows across his conflicted face. The engines grew louder, the convoy just minutes away. "Fine," Mason growled, his voice begrudging. "But if Lang doesn't get me, you will." With Mason temporarily on their side, the three men scrambled to fortify the house. Conrad reactivated what was left of the surveillance system, while Mason laid traps using the tools strewn around the property. John stood at the center of it all, his mind a flurry of strategy and determination. "Lang's men will hit hard, but they're expecting us to run scared. We don't. We hold the line here." Conrad glanced at Mason, distrust clear in his expression. "And what's stopping him from turning on us the second they show up?" John didn't answer. His focus was on the horizon, where the first headlights appeared, piercing through the smoke. "Positions," he ordered, his voice steady. As Lang's convoy pulled into the driveway, a floodlight on one of the SUVs illuminated the porch. Mason, hidden in the shadows, tightened his grip on his weapon. John and Conrad exchanged a tense glance, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Would Mason fight with them or against them? The roar of engines faded as Lang's convoy came to a halt in the driveway, headlights casting harsh beams across the smoldering remains of the porch. The lead SUV's door opened, and a tall, muscular man stepped out, his polished leather boots crunching against the gravel. Victor Lang. He stood with the confidence of a man who never faced consequences, surveying the property with a predator's eye. Behind him, his men emerged, armed and ready, spreading out in calculated formations. "Mr. Harris," Lang called, his voice cutting through the smoke-filled air. "Let's not make this more unpleasant than it has to be. Hand over the documents, and I promise to leave you in one piece." Inside the house, John, Conrad, and Mason crouched near the windows, watching Lang's every move. Conrad whispered into his comms, relaying the situation to the backup team that was still miles away. John didn't flinch. "He's not leaving without a fight," he said quietly. "And you think you're going to win this?" Mason muttered. "There's a dozen of them out there, maybe more." John's eyes didn't leave the window. "You can run if you want to." Mason's jaw tightened, his grip on his weapon firming. "Not a chance." Lang signaled to his men and they began to move toward the house. Two broke off toward the side entrance, rifles at the ready. Another group advanced on the main door. John waited until they were close, then nodded to Conrad. "Now." A hidden tripwire activated, triggering a burst of blinding light and a deafening bang, a flashbang Mason had rigged near the side entrance. The advancing men stumbled, disoriented as Conrad opened fire from the second-floor window, forcing them to retreat. At the main entrance, Mason flung open the door, throwing a makeshift smoke bomb into the crowd. Lang's men scattered, shouting orders, their visibility cut to near zero. Amid the chaos, John stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun aimed steadily at Lang. "You came all this way for nothing, Lang," he called. "There's nothing here for you." Lang chuckled, unaffected by the commotion around him. "You expect me to believe that, Harris? You've been hiding something, and I'm going to find it, one way or another." Lang raised a hand, and his men regrouped quickly, their training evident. They began firing suppressive shots toward the house, forcing John and Mason to retreat inside. "This isn't going to hold much longer," Conrad shouted over the noise. John reloaded his shotgun, his movements calm and deliberate. "We don't need it to. Just long enough to turn the tide." Mason, stationed near the back, caught sight of a figure moving through the smoke. He fired a warning shot, narrowly missing one of Lang's lieutenants. "They're flanking us," he growled. John glanced at Conrad. "Plan B?" Conrad smirked. "Always." He activated a remote detonator, and one of the traps near the rear of the property exploded, sending debris flying. Lang's men scrambled, their formation breaking apart. Amid the confusion, Lang stepped forward, undeterred. He pulled out a small device from his coat, a jammer. With the flick of a switch, the comms and surveillance systems inside the house went dark. "That's enough playing around," Lang said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You think you're clever, Harris? I faced worse than you. Now, hand over what I came for." John's eyes narrowed. "You've got one chance to leave, Lang." Lang's smirk widened. "Or what? You'll take me down? You're one man. One old man, at that." John's reply was a low, dangerous growl. "Try me." Lang's men surged forward and the firefight erupted into full chaos. John and Mason held their ground, firing strategically to keep the attackers at bay. Conrad, despite his reluctance, manned the second floor, picking off targets with sharp precision. But Lang was relentless, his men gradually closing the distance. The house shook with the force of their assault, walls splintering under the barrage of bullets. Just as it seemed the house wouldn't hold, a new sound broke through the chaos, a low, rumbling growl that grew louder by the second. Conrad glanced out the window and grinned. "Backup's here." A convoy of black SUVs and tactical vehicles roared onto the property, federal agents spilling out and taking up defensive positions. Lang's men hesitated, their confidence wavering as they found themselves outgunned. Lang raised his hands slowly, a sly smile on his face even as his men were subdued. "You think this is over, Harris?" he said, his tone calm. "You've won the battle, but the war is far from done." As the federal agents moved to secure Lang, his words lingered in John's mind. What did Lang mean? And what more was at stake than just his property? As Lang's men were cuffed and taken away by federal agents, the tension on John Harris's property began to ease. The flames on the porch had been extinguished, but the marks of the night's battle, shattered windows, splintered wood, and bullet casings, remained. Lang was the last to be escorted to one of the black SUVs. He glanced back at John, a calm yet chilling smirk on his face. "This isn't over, old man. You have no idea what's coming." John watched him go, his face impassive but his mind alert. He turned to Conrad, who stood beside him, dusting off his jacket. "You think he's bluffing?" Conrad asked. John shook his head. "Men like Lang don't bluff. They scheme." Mason, leaning against the doorway, crossed his arms. "So, what now? You just go back to sipping coffee on your porch like none of this happened?" John smirked faintly. "Something like that, but not before I tie up some loose ends." The next day, the house was quiet again. The broken glass and debris had been cleared, the scars of the battle lingering only in memory. John sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Conrad approached, a folder in his grip. "Here it is," he said, handing it to John. "Everything we've got on Lang's syndicate. The feds will handle the rest, but I figured you'd want to know where it's going." John took the folder and set it aside. "I'm not worried about Lang anymore. He's out of the game, for now." Conrad raised an eyebrow. "And Mason? Think he'll stick around?" John glanced toward the woods where Mason was pacing, his movements restless. "I'll give him the same thing I'd give anyone who earned it. A second chance. Whether he takes it is up to him." Conrad nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Not everyone would be so forgiving." John shrugged. "I've lived long enough to know that holding grudges doesn't bring peace. Action does." As the camera zooms out from John's quiet porch, the narrator's voice speaks with gravity and hope. In the end, John Harris showed us that age is no barrier to courage. He reminded us that even when the odds are stacked against you, standing firm for what you believe in can make all the difference. His resilience, strategy, and unwavering determination proved that justice isn't about power, it's about heart. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video and share it with others who need a reminder of what true bravery looks like. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of kindness, courage, and triumph. And remember, sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest impact.